The hot, humid evening in Louisiana flowed over the ground like an invisible, pressing weight, enveloping the streets with thick air and a sense of stagnation. It was still light outside, though dusk was already creeping up on the city, hiding it behind a shroud of calm. The town Tamara Williams lived in seemed peaceful and serene. But Tamara, standing at the window of her spacious home, felt something else entirely. Something was stirring in her chest, as if an invisible threat lurked nearby, just waiting to break through. She ran her finger along the glass of the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured courtyard in the evening shadows. With each passing day, that luxurious picture, the house, the husband, the successful career, seemed more distant and alien. From the moment her thoughts began to be troubled by strange, impenetrable doubts, life had become a dim backdrop, as if color had faded from her being. It all started with small details: Kaylin's delays at work, his inexplicable phone calls, and the frequent meetings with her cousin Amanda that suddenly became all too frequent. Amanda was always sweet and considerate, a little younger than Tamara, but always cheerful, like a ray of sunshine that could brighten any gloomy day. Tamara's family loved Amanda as their own daughter, and Tamara herself had always considered her the closest relative, almost a sister. Amanda was often at their house, especially lately, which didn't raise Tamara's suspicions from the start. After all, they had always been friends. But now, looking at these unexpected visits, she couldn't rid herself of the strange feeling that had been building up in her heart time and time again. A headlight cut through the gloom, and Tamara immediately recognized the familiar sound. It was Kaylin's car. He was coming home later than he'd promised, as usual. For the past few months, he'd been staying late at work more and more often, citing projects that required his constant attention. Sometimes this was accompanied by embarrassed apologies, sometimes by annoyance if she started asking too many questions. When he entered the house, his face was habitually focused, but Tamara caught something new in his eyes, some shadow, some vague anxiety. Or perhaps it was just her imagination playing out with uncertainty. He walked toward her, kissed her cheek, and strode into the living room, taking off his jacket and tossing it on the back of a chair. Tamara watched his every move with a scrutiny she hadn't experienced before. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to keep her voice as casual as possible. "Tired as always," he answered briefly, rubbing his temples. The usual response, a standard response she'd heard many times before. But this time, something was different. Her gaze fell to his phone, which lay on the coffee table. A few months ago, Kaylin had changed his habit. Now he rarely left his phone within her reach. Usually the device always remained at his fingertips, as if he was afraid of missing something important. But now, for a brief moment, it was in front of her. Tamara felt a prick of desire to grab it, to read the messages or see the call list, but immediately restrained herself. She wasn't the kind of person to spy on her husband, or maybe she was just afraid of what she might find there. Instead, she took a deep breath and asked, "Have you talked to Amanda? She called me today, said she wanted to meet." Kaylin froze for a second. His face remained calm, but Tamara noticed him subtly tense before he answered. "Yeah, called me too. Seems she's having some trouble with her job, asking for advice." Tamara frowned. Job problems? Amanda had never mentioned any difficulties lately. On the contrary, everything seemed to be going smoothly for her. It was a small thing, but for some reason, it was the one that stuck in her mind. In the back of her mind, it was starting to bother her that Kaylin and Amanda were socializing too much without even letting her know. "She's been dropping by a lot lately," Tamara remarked, hoping her words would sound non-accusatory. "Yes," Kaylin answered briefly, not looking at her. "I thought you were happy to see her." His tone was so casual that even trying to continue the conversation seemed futile. Tamara pretended to forget about it, but in fact her suspicions were only growing stronger. She sensed that something was going on, but she couldn't find proof. Every word he said, every gesture, every phone call became little pieces of a huge puzzle, but she couldn't see the full picture. Over the next few days, Kaylin continued to show up late, and those moments when she was alone in the house became torture for her. She couldn't get rid of the intrusive thoughts that plagued her like thousands of tiny needles digging into her mind. Every time Amanda called or came to their house, Tamara felt a strange tension. Their conversations with Kaylin became more and more reserved, as if they were hiding something from her but couldn't show it. One late afternoon, when Kaylin was lingering again, Tamara sat in the silence of their bedroom, scrutinizing her reflection in the mirror. Her own eyes seemed to be asking her, "What's going on?" She noticed that she had become different, hesitant, full of doubt. It was as if something inside her had broken long ago and she just didn't want to admit it. When Kaylin finally came in, his face was as grim as ever. He gave her a quick glance and told her he had an important meeting tomorrow. This time, Tamara couldn't resist. "Do you really go to work, or are you just meeting someone?" He froze for a moment and a heavy silence hung in the air. "What do you mean by that?" he asked coldly, his voice a little harsher. "You know what I mean. It's like you've been different lately. Constant calls, meetings, Amanda's at our place almost every day. What's going on, Kaylin?" He exhaled slowly, turning away from her. "You're imagining things, Tamara. It's just work." Tamara felt her heart slow down. She'd learned nothing again. The answers were sinking into the shadows, but something deep inside her still screamed. The truth couldn't be that far away. She never spoke of it again. But from then on, a shadow settled in her house forever. It had been a week since the night Tamara had first allowed herself to speak to Kaylin about her suspicions. Their conversation had ended in nothing. His assurances that everything was fine had left only bitterness and coldness in her soul. However, Tamara couldn't just let go of her feelings. The shadow of distrust continued to haunt her like a dark premonition that couldn't be ignored. Kaylin still came home late, avoided unnecessary conversation, and averted his eyes when she asked him about work. Amanda also started showing up at their house less often, which seemed odd considering her recent frequent activity. Tamara felt like a prisoner of her own thoughts, unsure of what to do next. Her suspicions grew every day, but there was still no proof. One evening, when Kaylin was late at work again, Tamara sat in the silence of their spacious kitchen. The light fell dimly on the polished surface of the table, and the muffled sound of cicadas could be heard outside the window. She glanced at the phone that lay in front of her, contemplating whether to call Amanda. Her cousin hadn't been in touch at all the last few days, which was odd. Amanda usually found a way to keep in touch even if she was busy. After much hesitation, Tamara dialed the number after all. The phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. An uneasiness curled in her stomach. Her thoughts began to take a familiar direction again. Something was wrong. Something was going on behind her back. She tried calling again, but again no answer. This was unusual for Amanda, who always answered the phone quickly, especially if Tamara called. The next day, the situation began to become even more alarming. Amanda still wasn't answering her phone, and when Tamara decided to stop by her house, she wasn't there. The neighbors hadn't seen her in days, and no one knew where she might have gone. For the first time in a long time, Tamara felt real fear. What if her fears that Amanda and Kaylin were hiding something had led to something terrible? 2 more days later, just as Tamara was beginning to panic, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but she immediately picked it up, hoping to hear Amanda's voice. "Mrs. Williams?" came the serious male voice on the other end of the line. "This is Detective Reed with the New Orleans Police Department. We have information regarding your cousin, Amanda Jackson." Tamara felt her heart clench. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "What's wrong with her?" The voice sounded calmer than she felt. "I'm afraid the news may come as a shock to you," the detective continued. "Amanda was found this morning. She's dead." The words pierced Tamara like a knife. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Amanda? Dead? It was impossible. Thoughts swirled in her head, as if jolted from reality. Her sweet, funny, bright Amanda was no longer alive? Where? How did this happen? Tamara barely spoke, clutching the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "Her body was found near the marshes," the detective answered slowly, his voice full of sympathy. "It's too early to draw conclusions, but it doesn't look like an accident. We've started an investigation and we're gathering all the evidence we can. We need to ask you some questions about her last days. When was the last time you saw her?" Tamara opened her mouth, trying to say something, but was speechless for a few seconds. Her mind flashed back to the last time she'd seen Amanda, to the strange phone calls she'd made, to how she'd been showing up at their house less and less often. When had they last seen each other? I think it was almost a week ago. The last time she'd dropped in for a brief visit, said almost nothing, and then disappeared as quickly as she'd come. Tamara had thought at the time that Amanda was just busy. "It was about a week ago," she finally answered, feeling her voice treacherously shaking. "She was at our house, but she didn't say much. I thought she just had a lot to do." "Did you notice anything unusual in her behavior? Maybe she seemed upset or nervous to you?" Tamara hesitated. She didn't feel like talking about her suspicions. She didn't know what it would mean for her and Kaylin, but her thoughts returned inexorably to their last conversation, to the way Amanda had become aloof and withdrawn. Maybe that was important. She was kind of strange, Tamara admitted. A little distracted. I thought she was just having a hard time at work. The detective thanked her for the information and promised to keep her informed about the investigation. When the conversation was over, Tamara sat still for a long time, staring at the phone in her hands. Her mind refused to accept what had happened. Amanda was dead. It seemed unreal. Pain gripped her heart, but along with the pain came even more disturbing thoughts. Tamara knew that her suspicions about Amanda and Kaylin were only part of the bigger picture. But what if this mystery was much deeper? What if there were much darker and scarier things lurking behind it that she couldn't even guess at? Kaylin came home later than usual, and Tamara, still under the influence of shock, only watched him in silence. He was tense, his gaze extinguished, like a man who had sunk into his thoughts and didn't want to share them with anyone. "Did you hear that?" she asked, as he sat down at the table, rubbing his temples tiredly. "Heard what?" he said indifferently, not looking at her. "About Amanda. She was found dead." Silence filled the room. Kaylin froze, his hand stopping halfway to the water glass. Then he raised his eyes to Tamara, and she caught something strange in his gaze, not shock, not pain, but something that looked more like fear or anxiety. "How?" he asked finally, his voice too flat to sound sincere. "Her body was found on the marshes. The police say it wasn't an accident," she said, watching his reaction carefully. Kaylin lowered his head, his face impassive. He slowly set the glass on the table and ran his hand over his face, as if trying to hide something. Tamara couldn't help but notice how nervous he was. But what did it mean? Was he really upset? Or was there something else lurking behind it? Tamara decided not to continue the conversation, though her mind was buzzing with questions. She sensed that something important was eluding her, that Kaylin wasn't telling her the whole story, but she didn't yet know how to get him to open up. This was just the beginning. Detective John Reed was one of those used to facing the worst sides of human nature. In his 20 years on the New Orleans police force, he'd seen it all: cold murders, brutal fights, betrayals, and lies. But each new death carried its own tragedy, and the case of Amanda Jackson immediately seemed to him particularly complex. When the young woman's body was found on the edge of the swamp, Reed knew at once that this was no ordinary crime. There was a thick fog over the marshes that day, hiding the world behind a thin veil. Amanda's body was found by a fisherman who had stumbled upon it by accident when he came to check his nets. The woman was lying on her stomach, her hair tangled, her clothes stained with mud. At first glance, it looked like an accident. The young woman had simply gotten lost and drowned in the marshes, but Detective Reed felt that this was only an outward appearance. An examination of the scene made it immediately clear to him it was murder. Amanda's body was neatly planted on the shore, her clothes not torn, as if she had been fighting for her life. Moreover, a slight expression of fear was evident on her face, as if, at the last moment before her death, she had realized what awaited her. Examining the body, Reed noticed the strangulation marks on her neck, faint but noticeable. This was not an accidental death. "She has no visible injuries," said one of the medical examiners examining the body. "But these marks on her neck clearly indicate a violent death. It's not an accident." Reed nodded, pocketing the notebook he'd been jotting down his observations. "Something tells me this isn't just a murder," he said thoughtfully. "There's more to it than that." He looked around. The swamps were empty, with only lone trees and murky water surrounding them. The place where the body had been found seemed cut off from the world. The killer must have known that his actions would go unnoticed if he hid the body here. Reed felt an uneasy feeling. Whoever had done this knew how to cover their tracks. When Amanda's body was taken to the morgue, the detective began looking for clues. The first thing he did was go to the home of the deceased's relatives. He needed to find out more about her life, her surroundings, and possibly those who might have wished her harm. He was met on the doorstep of the Williams home by a scowling, middle-aged woman, Tamara, Kaylin Williams' wife. Her eyes were red from crying, but she tried to stay calm. "Detective Reed," he introduced himself, showing his ID. "I'm investigating the death of your sister, Amanda Jackson. I need to ask you a few questions." Tamara nodded, inviting him inside. The spacious living room smelled of coffee and despair. The woman's husband, Kaylin, was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a detached look. Reed immediately sensed that this family was harboring more than just grief of loss. "When was the last time you saw Amanda?" Reed began, pulling out a notebook. Tamara looked confused. "A week ago," she answered quietly. "She came to my house, worried about something, but didn't say anything specific. We haven't spoken since. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer." Reed raised his eyes to Kaylin, who sat in the corner, avoiding the detective's gaze. "What about you, Mr. Williams? When was the last time you saw her?" Reed asked, watching his reaction. Kaylin raised his head slowly, his gaze blank. "I've seen her a couple times," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "We occasionally chatted when she stopped by for a visit. The last time was a few days ago when she came by on business. I don't know what happened to her." The tone of his voice was cold, as if Amanda's death hadn't affected him as much as it should have. Reed noticed that Kaylin avoided looking directly at his wife. There was clearly some tension between them. Was she having trouble with someone? Someone who might want to hurt her? Reed asked, turning to Tamara. Tamara shook her head. "No, she didn't tell me about any enemies. She always had a good relationship with people, especially her family. The only thing that bothered me was..." She hesitated, as if hesitating to say something important. Reed stepped forward, sensing that something really important was about to be said. "What was bothering you?" he asked softly. Tamara looked at her husband, then back at the detective. Amanda had been acting strangely lately. She seemed nervous, often avoiding conversation. I even thought she might be having some trouble on the personal front. Maybe she was seeing someone and it got her killed? But she never told me anything specific. Reed nodded. This information could prove important. If Amanda was seeing someone, it could explain her strange behavior and maybe even her death. In Reed's eyes, however, Kaylin looked increasingly suspicious. His silence and detachment seemed abnormal for a man who had lost a relative. After meeting with Williams, Reed headed to the local police station to meet with his colleagues and discuss next steps. An important aspect of the investigation was the examination of Amanda's phone records. As they gained access to her phone, the situation began to become clearer. The screen flashed dozens of missed messages from one person, Kaylin Williams. Reed felt his pulse quicken. Why hadn't Kaylin said they'd been in touch so often? Why had he kept that fact from his wife? The messages were full of hints of some private meetings and conversations that clearly weren't about family matters. Reed read one of the last messages. "We need to talk. It's important. I can't live like this anymore." It sounded like Amanda was desperate. But from what? Or perhaps from whom? That question troubled Reed more and more. "We need to question Kaylin again," Reed told his partner, Detective Marcus Greenwood. "He's obviously hiding something." "You think he's involved?" Marcus asked incredulously. "It's too early to draw conclusions, but his behavior is suspicious," Reed replied, immersed in his own thoughts. "Besides, his constant contact with Amanda in the days before her death is not something you can just ignore." The next day, Reed returned to the Williams house, this time with a police warrant for questioning. Kaylin met them on the doorstep with a stone face, but Reed didn't give him a chance to avoid the conversation. "Mr. Williams, we have new information that requires your explanation," the detective began, as they sat down in the living room. Kaylin tried to remain calm, but his hands were shaking. "What is this about?" he asked. "About your frequent contact with Amanda in the last days before her death. You didn't mention that you were in regular contact with her, even though she wrote to you repeatedly." Kaylin tensed, as if he felt he was being backed into a corner. "We just talked, nothing special," he began to justify himself. Amanda was going through a hard time, and I was just trying to help her. There's nothing weird about that. Did you tell her that you couldn't live like this anymore? Reed quoted one of the messages, casting a hard stare at Kaylin. The man turned pale. It's not what you think, he said, but Reed felt the words sticking in his throat. Then tell us what it means, Reed demanded quietly but insistently. Kaylin sighed heavily and lowered his head. His body tensed as he struggled with the internal decision of whether to tell the truth or continue lying. The tense silence dragged on, and Reed felt like something was about to happen. But suddenly Kaylin looked up, and his eyes, full of anxiety, met the detective's. I didn't want to talk about it because I didn't know how my wife would take it, he began quietly, as if afraid of his own voice. But I was really close to Amanda, closer than I should have been. Reed held back his emotions. He'd been prepared for this, but still, every word Kaylin said sounded like a nail in the coffin of their family secret. What do you mean, closer? The detective asked cautiously. We started seeing each other a few months ago, Kaylin said quickly, as if in a hurry to get rid of the burden. It started casually, but then it got out of control. I wanted to stop, but Amanda wouldn't let me stop. She was emotionally unstable, constantly threatening to tell my wife everything if I didn't leave her. It was a nightmare. Reed nodded, but didn't interrupt Kaylin. He knew the man needed to talk right now. The last few days before she died, she started texting and calling me, begging to see me. I agreed because I couldn't take the pressure anymore. The day she died, we met at a cafe. She told me she was pregnant. Kaylin stopped talking, his face contorted in pain. She demanded I leave Tamra, and if I didn't, she'd tell me everything. The detectives looked at each other in silence. This confession changed everything, but it didn't solve the biggest mystery. How did Amanda end up dead? And what happened after the meeting? Marcus asked, as Reed continued to study Kaylin's reaction. I was in shock, but I told her I wasn't going to leave my wife. We had a fight and she left. Kaylin spoke faster and faster, as if he wanted to get the truth out as quickly as possible. I never saw her after that. I swear I didn't kill her. But you were the last person to see her alive, Reed reminded him coldly. And you had motive. Kaylin turned even paler, realizing that his situation was getting worse. I didn't kill her. Yes, we had our problems, but I would never... He stopped talking, covering his face with his hands. I just wanted it all to be over. Reed listened intently, but his experience told him that Kaylin's confession was just the tip of the iceberg. He understood that the love triangle between Kaylin, Tamra, and Amanda was the basis for the tragedy. But there were still a lot of questions. How had Amanda ended up in the swamps? And most importantly, who killed her? After the interrogation, Reed gathered his team to discuss next steps. Kaylin's confession was a strong argument, but the detective felt it wasn't enough to draw any conclusions. We need to look into her surroundings in more detail, Reed began in the meeting. First of all, we need to find out if Amanda had any other connections besides Kaylin. She could be seeing someone else. Maybe that person was the real threat. I'll check her calls and emails from the last few weeks, Marcus suggested. That might give us some additional leads. One more thing, Reed added. We know Amanda was pregnant. That could be a key factor. We need to see if the baby was really Kaylin's, or if there's someone else we don't know about yet. A few days after Kaylin's interrogation, Marcus brought big news. He found traces of another contact in Amanda's phone, a man named Lawrence Miller, with whom she had been corresponding for the past few months. This man had left seemingly innocuous messages, but their tone had changed in recent weeks. In recent messages, Lawrence openly threatened Amanda if she continued to communicate with Kaylin. Looks like we found another suspect, Reed said as he studied the correspondence. Lawrence was clearly unhappy with Amanda's infatuation with Kaylin. Marcus nodded. He works for a construction company, lives in the suburbs. We should interrogate him. Reed agreed. Lawrence Miller was the missing piece of the puzzle. All his correspondence suggested he was in love with Amanda, but she seemed to be using him to deal with personal problems. When Lawrence learned of her affair with Kaylin, his jealousy and anger escalated, which may have been the catalyst for the murder. Reed and Marcus visited Lawrence at his house. The man, a short man with a sturdy build, greeted them warily. There was a look of concern in his eyes as the detectives entered his home. We know you were close to Amanda Jackson, Reed began, watching his reaction. "And we know that you were unhappy with her relationship with Kaylin Williams." Lawrence tensed. "That's none of your business," he replied sharply. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you mean. Yes, we were close, but I would never have touched her." Reed didn't give him a chance to get off the subject. "Then why are there threats in your messages? You said if she didn't stop seeing Kaylin, she'd regret it. That doesn't sound like harmless correspondence." Lawrence rose abruptly from his seat, his face reddening. "They were just words!" he shouted. "I was angry, but I didn't kill her. Yes, I threatened her because she was using me, but I would never do that." Reed and Marcus continued to press him, forcing Lawrence to tell more. After several hours of questioning, he began to break down. He admitted that he had followed Amanda and Kaylin on the day of the murder, but he hadn't killed her. "I only wanted to talk to her," Lawrence said, his voice shaking. "But when I got to the swamps, she was gone. All I found was her car." With each new piece of evidence, the picture became more and more confusing. Reed sensed that Amanda's murder was not a simple outburst of jealousy, but something much more complex. The investigation into Amanda Jackson's murder was walking on thin ice, balancing facts and conjecture. Each new witness, each piece of evidence, seemed to only complicate the case. Now that Reed had several suspects, including Kaylin Williams and Lawrence Miller, the detective realized, one of them was clearly hiding something. But who? With each passing day, Reed felt more and more pressure building. The city had a life of its own, but behind the walls of the police station, work was going on. The detective knew that this case required not just factual skills, but intuition, and every step could lead to either a clue or a dead end. On the third day of the investigation, the lab received the first results. The medical examiner had a thorough examination of Amanda's body, and some of the findings were surprising. "Detective, you need to see this." Medical examiner Carla Stone met Reed in the hallway, holding several printouts. "We've finished analyzing Jackson's body, and we have some conflicting results." Reed waited tensely as Carla spread the papers out on the table. She began to explain. First of all, there were indeed strangulation marks on her neck. However, judging from the indentation in the fabric, the killer used a rope or belt, not just his hands. That already ruled out accidental strangulation or panic on the part of the attacker. Reed nodded, trying to relate this information to what he already knew about the suspects. "Second, we found traces of soil under her fingernails," Carla continued. "And this is where things get weird. The soil doesn't match the soil in the area of the swamp where the body was found." That statement made Reed freeze. "Where was it before it went into the swamp?" he asked, already sensing that he was getting more questions than answers. "We did some more research and found that this soil is more consistent with areas near roads and paved areas. That means Amanda was most likely killed elsewhere and then moved into the swamp to cover her tracks." Carla folded her hands neatly in front of her. "It was done deliberately." The detective stood up and walked around the office. So the killer had definitely planned his operation. It wasn't an impulsive act. But if so, which of the suspects was capable of such cold-bloodedness? "There's one more detail," Carla continued as Reed was about to leave her office. "We found traces of a drug in her blood, a mild tranquilizer. Not the kind used for medical purposes, but strong enough to incapacitate a person for several hours." Reed stopped. This was a game changer. If Amanda had been drugged first and then strangled and her body moved, then this murder was even more planned and elaborate. "Thank you, Carla," the detective said quietly. "We're on the right track." Back at the station, Reed immediately called the team together. Detective Marcus Greenwood was already aware of the latest news and was waiting impatiently for the detective. "What do you think?" Marcus asked as Reed entered the room. "The murder was definitely planned. The soil on her fingernails doesn't match where the body was found. She was moved. Also, she was given a tranquilizer before the murder," Reed stated succinctly. "This isn't just a jealous outburst of emotion anymore. It's a complex operation." Marcus nodded, taking the lead. "I checked Lawrence Miller's cell phone. There's nothing there that can directly point us to his involvement in the murder. However, he was definitely following Amanda the day she died. He admitted that himself." Reed thought for a moment. Lawrence looked like the perfect candidate for the role of the killer, but his motives didn't yet add up to a coherent picture. Kaylin, however, remained under suspicion. His affair with Amanda had clearly spiraled out of control, but could he have decided to commit murder? Detectives received the results of the analysis of Amanda's car. The car was found on the outskirts of town, near the road leading to the swamp. There were no signs of a struggle inside, but they found fingerprints on the driver's seat, ones that didn't belong to Amanda. The owner was Kaylin Williams. "Damn it," Marcus exhaled when they got the results back. "He was in the car with her the day of the murder." Reed nodded slowly. "That doesn't mean he killed her yet," the detective replied. "But he was with her. Maybe he knows more than he's saying." Now they had enough reason to question Kaylin again. His silence was beginning to seem more and more suspicious. "We should question him again," Reed said. "This time we have evidence." Kaylin was called to the police station. He came in without a lawyer, convinced it was all a misunderstanding. But as soon as Reed showed him the forensic results, his face turned pale. "Your fingerprints were found in Amanda's car the day she died," Reed began, watching his reaction. "And we have evidence that the body was moved after her death. You were with her that day, Kaylin. That's a fact. Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Kaylin remained silent, clenching his fists tightly. He clearly realized that the situation was getting out of his control. "We know you were having an affair with Amanda," Reed continued. "You kept it from your wife and the police, but now the truth is coming out. You'd better tell us now before it gets any worse." Kaylin sighed heavily, his face contorted in pain. He was cornered, and Reed could see that the man was on edge. "I didn't kill her," Kaylin whispered. "But yes, I was with her that day." "Then tell us what happened," Reed ordered. Detective Reed watched Kaylin Williams's face closely. The man was clearly on edge. The interrogator's room seemed to be shrinking around him. Each question Reed asked was like a knife penetrating deeper into Kaylin's mind. But Reed knew it was moments like these that could get to the truth. "I'm waiting, Kaylin," the detective repeated, not taking his eyes off the suspect. Kaylin looked up, and his voice sounded quiet, almost broken. "I've told you everything I can. Yes, I was with her that day. I wanted to talk. I didn't kill her." Reed was in no hurry to press him. He realized there were too many inconsistencies in this case, and it was important to piece together every little detail. "We know the body was moved," Reed continued. "It was in the swamp, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Amanda was killed somewhere else. Where was it, Kaylin?" The man faltered, his breathing becoming ragged. It was obvious he was fighting himself, but Reed couldn't let him get away with it. At that moment, Marcus entered the room with the new test results. His face was tense, which made Reed tense up even more. "What have you got?" Reed asked, not taking his eyes off Kaylin. "We checked Amanda's clothes," Marcus began, opening the results folder. "We found traces of earth and sand, not only from the swamp, but also from the lot near her house. Most likely that's where the murder took place. And more interestingly, they found fibers from a black sweater on her shirt, like the one Kaylin had been wearing the day she died." Reed slowly turned to Kaylin, who was visibly pale. This evidence was becoming more and more convincing. "Your fingerprints in the car," Marcus continued. "Your fibers on her clothes. You were there when it happened. Anything else you want to add?" Kaylin covered his face with his hands. Reed realized the man was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but the truth had to come out. Kaylin's confession could be the key to completing the investigation. "I was at her house," he began abruptly, hands down and teeth clenched. "We met to talk about her being pregnant. I was furious, but I swear I didn't kill her." "Then tell me what happened next," Reed demanded calmly but firmly. Kaylin swallowed, breathing hard. "We had a fight. She started yelling at me that she was going to tell Tamara everything, that I would have to leave the family. I tried to calm her down, but she lost her temper, so I just left. When I came back a few hours later, she was gone." "You came back?" Reed questioned, tense. "Why?" Kaylin shook his head, clearly frightened. "I don't know, I was afraid she'd actually do something. I wanted to make sure she was okay, but when I got back I saw her car outside the house, but she wasn't there anymore. I thought she'd gone somewhere." Reed was having a hard time with this story. It sounded too inconclusive. But the new data kept coming in, and soon the moment came when the whole picture finally began to come together. Marcus brought new results. The belt used to strangle Amanda had traces of blood on it. But that blood didn't belong to her. It belonged to another person. It was strange. and this discovery called all assumptions into question. Who else could have been at the crime scene? "We ran a DNA test," Marcus continued, "and the blood doesn't belong to Kaylin or Lawrence. It belongs to a woman, and that woman is Tamara Williams." Reed froze. Tamara? This discovery was a game changer. Tamara was there, Reed whispered, realizing they now had a new suspect. But could she have been involved? Marcus nodded. "Yes, and that seriously changes everything. We have to interrogate her." Reed couldn't believe that Tamara, who seemed so harmless and loyal, could have been involved in Amanda's death. But the evidence spoke for itself. Her blood on the murder weapon meant she was there when it happened. When Reed arrived at Tamara's home, the woman looked tired and depressed. Her face was haggard and pain glowed in her eyes. She knew why the detective had come and seemed ready to tell her side of the story. "I know why you're here," she said weakly, inviting Reed in. "I have nothing more to hide." They sat down at the table, and Reed gave her time to gather her thoughts. Tamara began to speak, as if relieving herself of the weight that had been weighing on her all these days. "I found out about Kaylin cheating on me with Amanda a few days ago. It was awful. I found her messages on his phone. He denied everything, but I knew the truth." Tamara was silent for a moment, clenching her hands into fists. "That day I decided to go to Amanda's house. I wanted to talk to her, to demand that she leave him alone." Reed listened intently, realizing that everything would soon become clear. "When I arrived at her place, she was out of her mind. We started fighting, and everything went wrong. She grabbed her belt, tried to hit me. I tried to defend myself, but it happened so fast. I didn't mean to kill her. It was an accident." Tamara covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do, so I called Kaylin. He came over, and together we decided to dispose of the body." Reed was silent. The truth had been revealed, and it was far darker than he'd realized. Tamara was not an innocent victim. She was a murderer, but a murderer by choice. The investigation had come to an end. Tamara confessed to the murder, but her story of the accident was partially plausible. However, the court would decide based on the evidence and her confession. Kaylin was also held responsible for his part in covering up the crime. Reed sat at his desk and contemplated how convoluted and layered this story was. What started out as a standard love triangle case had turned into a complex drama in which no one was truly innocent. Tamara and Kaylin's world crumbled like a house of cards. And now Detective Reed could close the case, but he bitterly realized that such stories never have happy endings. The guilty were punished, but the price they paid was too high for everyone.